Welcome to the first installment of Phenomenology. This part's called What Is It? We're talking about a group of people who are being simultaneously social and creative. And this is not unknown to humanity. We've seen all kinds of media and production of entertainment phenomena in the past. This one, I think, has unique properties. And I'll break it into two related parts. One part is that historically, if we're talking about something that produces fiction, there's often been a big separation between what the author goes through and what the audience goes through. Look at it this way. Here is a creative person who is producing a work of fiction of some kind and undergoes who knows what. Maybe they very deliberately have some sort of process that they check off line by line. Maybe, on the other hand, they're in a hallucinatory haze of creativity, some kind of fugue state, and poof, they find they have a story. It doesn't matter. I really want to focus on the bits and pieces of this fiction. I said story, I really just mean fiction. Anyway, they are producing its bits and pieces, and who knows how those bits and pieces will be put together or in what order they were created. Let's hop over to the audience circumstance receiving this thing in some form. 5 minutes later, 500 years later, doesn't matter, and they experience it in the order in which it's presented. Maybe it can be presented in different kinds of order each time, but whatever, they experience it in some order and in some way. When they begin to start experiencing it as fiction, and how they process that into some kind of engagement is an entirely different process from whatever it is that that author did. They're disconnected. The author part has been historically typically obscured, typically invisible. Typically, it's even kept a bit invisible. To the extent, maybe, that you have encountered it as a mystic thing. It's been said to you, oh, that's mystic. Who knows what happens? It's ineffable. Or maybe it's been reduced in some form to a neurosis. We identify whatever's wrong with that person such that they were able to do this. Yet another way is to create a kind of professional mystique that someone can try and try and try and try, and they'll never be anything but a hack, and this other person somehow has it. I want to get away from all that. I want to say that here in this activity we're talking about today, the weird thing is whatever those two processes are, they're happening at the same time. Furthermore, the first one, the author one, is naked. It is exposed. It is in process, subject to the scrutiny not only of fellow creators, but also to the same people, including that same practitioner, as audience. So it's a very weird and different thing. Maybe there are some historical parallels, maybe not. Now for the second, and as I said, tied in component. And in this case, I'm going to use a difficult word, which is story. And I want to focus just for a moment on the fact that historically, all these years, typically when somebody or somebodies make fiction, they're also producing a story. We'll leave whatever edge cases you can think of off the table for the moment. I'm saying this is typically what has happened with literature and a variety of other derived phenomena. So we have the making of fiction has been very frequently synonymous with the making of a story. This can be a little bit confusing. One might say, well, wait a minute, aren't they the same thing? Or one might say, well, what is the very difference between, I don't know, when is a fiction not a story? And all this kind of hyper-analytical approach. I just want to keep it easy. Let's talk about the fiction as the people were imagining or thinking about or visualizing, seeing on a screen, engaging with, doing their thing, being in their situations, and the notion of fiction as a medium in which this is made, of which this is made. Let's get away from terms like the narrative, which kind of throw them all together into a blender, and instead say, this is kind of interesting. Given what I said about that author separation, in most media, the way that the author grapples with the stuff of fiction, and in the case we're talking about, a story is produced. One even hesitates to say the author creates the story because that's so loaded. But frankly, if they didn't do it, it wouldn't happen. So ipso facto, the author is creating the story somehow. And then we have what the audience goes through when they encounter the physical medium in question and they are engaging with it. They're not passive. Audiences are not just kind of this blank slate onto which the fictional content is written, unless their gears of engagement engage with whatever they're encountering, unless their criteria for what makes an enjoyable experience, in this case, we'll just go ahead and say the taboo words, a good story, unless that happens, and they've got criteria for that, then it's an unsuccessful phenomenon. Let's talk, though, about, again, there's a bit of a difference now. When we might say, suppose some third party that we're not going to have to argue with says, aha, right there, X minutes into it, that's when this fiction watching audience in the movie circumstance clicked, and generally most people in there were on board with watching this as a story. Now, what did that have to do with when the creators were doing it? Perhaps that particular moment that was so important from an audience standpoint and early on actually didn't get shaped until the last 14 minutes before that film's edited form went into the can. They don't have to correspond. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's very likely that they don't. Whereas here, again, in our medium that I'm talking about now, where the medium of fiction is being produced and whatever content it may have, for example, a story, how those get shaped and in an authorial sense snap into place, and in an audience sense snap into engagement as such, those are happening at the same time. And that deserves special attention. Well, I've mentioned the word medium, and if we were talking about music, we would be talking about sonics and harmonics and a variety of physical instrumentation. If we were talking about literature in its prose form that's read on a page of some kind, we would be talking a lot about grammar. We would be talking about language. We would be talking about words in juxtaposition with one another. I could go on, and it doesn't really matter. You're just as good at this as I am. There is a stuff of which these kinds of entertainment media that involve fiction, there is a stuff of which each one is made. I'm not really talking about the instrumentation of reception. For example, you might listen to a concert through your speakers. You might be listening to it while you're sitting there watching them. You might be reading a book in page form or on a screen, or have somebody read it to you as you're driving or something like that. That's not really where I'm at with this. I'm talking about its much more basic medium, the stuff it's composed of. Now, in this case, we're talking about something frighteningly low-tech. People are just talking with one another. Maybe it's not just talking in the diminutive or dismissive sense. People are talking to one another in a fashion of using what one another is saying. Hearing, listening has to be involved. And the uptake and the utilizing what you hear is also a big piece of it. One doesn't just say a thing, one sees or hears someone else take it up and then have it delivered back in some modified or at least acknowledged form. This kind of ongoing attention and this ongoing uptake and return are the medium of tabletop role playing. And its primary feature, I want to stress, is a vividness of experience. This isn't the same as an elaborate description. It is evident in when what someone says is taken up and when it is repurposed, redelivered, and referred to in subsequent deliveries, subsequent statements, that it's done so in a way that lets everybody know there's been some processing and the imagination of that thing is enhanced. It may be enhanced much more internally than in the auditory space. But if I, for example, say something a little differently or with a personal spin on what you said, then everybody is working with it from multiple angles. Now, this vividness begins with personal investment into what we're imagining. But it swiftly can become much richer than that and only exist in the context of this ongoing attention and uptake and return. So one other aspect of this provides, I think, a lot of power, which is that what's happening in the produced fiction contains consequences. There is a statement of made, there is an uptake of it, and then there is a return, and sometimes that return involves causality. What you said, I'm taking up and using. What happens, the way we work with it, takes on a causal feature that we are now all committed to. So, vividness and consequence. And it's all composed and added to, if not described in purple detail, in fact, probably less so, composed of this attentiveness and how we talk subsequently. So this medium in terms of our usage is one thing. What is the medium in terms of its content? Well, here we have something that's a lot like what we see in most other existing fiction. We typically have an imagined scenario, an imagined situation with individuals in it that are recognizable as characters. They don't have to be anthropomorphic. They can be little cubes with little eyeballs, or they could be imagined as insanely inhuman in some unguessable fashion, or any number of things. They could simply be fuzzy people like animals, or they can be entirely naturalistic. Just as with all other forms of fiction, none of that matters as long as some degree of identification is occurring. Really, you don't need much for identification. Two little round circles and a couple of dots in each one typically does the job. Anything vaguely resembling a face, anything whose behavior, even if it looks nothing like a face, but whose behavior we say, aha, that is an instance of doing that, is sufficient for the job. Now, I want to break that open even further. We've seen this with other media. We've seen that comics, in particular for our generation, really went through a big transition. First, of people recognizing that the term comics is properly applied far beyond a 32-page stapled pamphlet that is produced, printed in a certain way, and purchased in a certain way. That newspaper strips were comics, that diagrams and instructional books and stuff like that were comics. That kind of broke things open a little bit. And as with all historical media, movies being an excellent example, that the initial content of what kind of characters and what kind of situations and what happens thereby, what historically was the early content is not to be confused with the medium. This has gone again and again. Novels were dreadful because they were only about wretched people undergoing terrible melodramatic crises. Movies were terrible because they depicted naughty bits, and then we could go on and on and on. Each different medium, as it becomes technologically available, gets pilloried for its starting content, and then through a generational turnover, people who grew up with the medium are saying, wait a minute, that's just what happened to be shown or done in at that particular time. That's not the medium itself. Same thing here. We are talking about the complete array and perhaps unique corners of what could conceivably be called fictional content. Given that range, it's too abstract. Given that a wide open thing, I mean, sure, we can write a book about anything, but to talk about anything is impossible. We have to get specific. A book. We have to get specific. A particular instance of tabletop role playing. And in that case, we find that that wide open quality disappears experientially. We're talking about this one. And the main components, as I mentioned before, we've got some kind of imaginable situation. We've got some sort of imaginable beings of agency within it, subject to circumstances. The word for this is idiom. It's not genre. Genre is much more limited and is often constrained in extremely economic ways, and it also usually implies the way things are expected to turn out. Idiom is before you get that far. Idiom is a little more open to the possibilities of a set of imagined circumstances rather than the constraints. So with idiom in place, we now can talk very much about an individual instance of play. The content is open, as I say, but now we've got our idiom that we're working with. The procedures are open, entirely open, about how we're going to conduct our behavior while we do this and how we're going to arrive at consequence and things like that. But the way we do it right now is the way we're doing it right now. So an observer of multiple instances of tabletop role-playing could see a diversity of content and a diversity of procedure. If they really look, they'll start to see some startling diversity. But in this one case of checking out how this one group is doing it or being in this one group that's doing it, we don't have to. They don't have to accord with one another. They don't have to obey how it's done over in that other group or at that other time or with that other game or anything like that. We can just stick right here. And so we can avoid all manner of how to do it in a prescriptive way and just talk about what on earth is it this time. I think there are two sets of specificity for looking at our group in action. And the first concerns the utterly social, the utterly personal, and the utterly ordinary question of who is it? And this matters a lot for any social group activity that we're trying to understand. At the broadest sense, what century is it? Let's get a little tighter and simply think in terms of the people. We can talk about their ages. We can talk about how well they know each other and how that varies from individual to individual, whether they get together to do anything else, or whether this is the one time they get together to do this thing, or whether this is indeed a single event, or whether this is one of a series of play events that this group conducts, in which case, how variable is attendance, all kinds of things like that. What economic circumstances are we talking about? What venue in general are we talking about? All manner of things that are just as relevant for this as they are to playing music, as they are to playing cards, as they are to enjoying any kind of leisure activity together. Interpersonal relationships among each participant, well, that's a whole nest of who knows what to consider. It's got its upside. They have to have some kind of interpersonal relationships among one another. They can't do this at all. There's all kinds of positive things we could talk about as far as that's concerned. We could also talk about some of the negative ones. We could think about the ones that are overt and acknowledged by people working together here, or we could talk about the ones that only some of them know about. Well, with all this in place, all I'm saying is that this is happening all the time in the context of tabletop role playing, and that, or better yet, that tabletop role playing is occurring in such a context no matter what. People don't really like the way that this is phrased, but I think the most accurate way to phrase it is that this group, whoever they are and however they're doing this, because of all these different things, are going to have certain rules for how they talk to one another. They probably can't say what those rules are out loud or think of them as rules at all, but when we kind of pull back a little bit and look at any group of people doing things together, we'll find that such rules are in place. There is something I alluded to as well, which is perhaps a little more comfortable to talk about, which is that how they conduct the production of the ongoing fiction logistically is also highly specific and interpersonal. We have this phrase, let's play. That's great. Without that phrase, let's play, this isn't going to happen. Let's break it down a little. In English, let's is a contraction of let us. And to put it in an active form, we will or we do. So we, the group of us here. Let's be a little blunt. That means at this time, for this instance of play that we're talking about, nobody else. This group could have been doing this with another composition of people. They're not. They're doing it here. That could be due to all manner of things, and I don't really care all the different ways that could have happened. The point is that it did. Here's another concern with let's play, which is let's play, we will, we do play, we play this game. We play this way is perhaps the better way to put that. We are doing it this way. This is how we do it. There's a set of things that are conducted. Many of us are familiar with the usual physicality of this medium, which involves dice or other instruments of that kind. We know there's a wide diversity, but however this group is doing it is the way they're doing it. Let's play is an extremely rich phrase. We play this way, this time. Now for that other form of specificity, which is beautifully put by the phrase playing on purpose. What do you do with the medium? We have our what, we have the idiom and various particularities of the idiom in this case, or more bluntly, what my guy is like. And we also have this group of people, the real people who have come together for this or that set of circumstances in which they are playing, in fact, this game this way. What are they doing with it? Get back to that vividness I was speaking of, how the introductory vividness was a matter of investment. You're bringing to one another, and it's currently unrealized until the attentiveness and the return begin. When those things begin and consequence of what happens is introduced, then we see, is the vividness coming into its unique and experiential in the moment form? Are we or are we not seeing the consequences occur and fictional time underway? And we need to think in terms of how this emerges only through doing it. The question is really straightforward. Am I glad I did it? Going back to the richness of Let's Play, am I glad that I played this way with this group of people? Is this something I like to do? Will I do it again? If I don't do it again, will I simply carry my life forward with gladness that I did do this with these people at this time? That's really straightforward. I don't care what you call it. Some people call it the fun. Other people hate that term and want to call it something else. It doesn't matter. When we have that occur, one can look at what the group is doing and one can say, they were there on purpose. They were there because they wanted to be there. What is the quality of the experience which led to that? Was it the vividness itself, a joy in the medium of its own self? Were there other dynamics at work? If something recognizable as a story was produced, was that in and of itself a priority? All manner of things might be identified as playing on purpose. And I'd like to focus on a few of them in the course of these discussions. Before doing so, I want to talk a bit about that difficult term, purpose. I've used the word agenda in the past, and I've used other terms in the past. Other people have used other terms in the past. And one of the things that really makes it hard to talk about is that it often gets confused by looking at the outcome of the fiction itself and saying, oh, okay, well, that was the purpose for these characters to have undergone this and have come out this way. That's not what I'm talking about. I really am talking about the purposes among ourselves, the shared aesthetics, the shared communications, the sense of being here together, and what that turns out to have been about, evident in watching us perhaps, evident in how we did it. I'll be focusing on that a lot. We also have a difficult procedural thing in which we acknowledge that just as with any of these other activities, the medium can fail. That this activity, the vividness, the consequential features of the ongoing fiction, they can break down. They can become so difficult to do that the effort becomes both tortuous and patched to keep it going. We also see circumstances in which people are simply not engaged. It's evident. They're just not engaged in what's going on. Now, it's kind of interesting because a person of low affect and minimal presentation can actually be very deeply engaged and very powerful in play with everybody else. Nor am I talking about the idea that everybody has to be in this hypnagogic attention to one another in some kind of almost, fugue state or something. All kinds of incidental talk and interaction and hopping up to get something to eat or whatever, all of that can be engaged in a very, very positive way. But there is an evident lack of engagement that spells the failure of the medium. And it's kind of a zilchy situation where everybody kind of desultorily fades in and out, and the uptake and return are limited both in their appearance and also limited in terms of who actually is doing it at the table or among the group. So keep those in mind. We don't really need to worry about what a game is. We don't really need to talk about whether it's a story or not. And we also need to acknowledge that there is a failure state of the medium, that once you aren't doing it, once you aren't failing at it, seems impossible. But if you are stuck in that, it's very, very difficult to consider any other aspect of the activity.